The lone rancher sent a message on a donkey. 3 days later, 200 donkeys appeared at his ranch. Dry Willow Flats hadn't seen rain in 117 days. The sun hung in the sky like a curse, bleaching the earth, boiling the air. Heat shimmered off the rocks and bent the light until even the shadows looked thirsty. Elijah Boone knelt beside his last water barrel, pressing his palm flat against the scalding iron rim. With a slow, prayerful motion, he tipped it forward, hoping, begging for a single drop. The inside was bone dry, not even a smear of mud. He sat back on his heels and stared across the silent ruin of what used to be a ranch. The wind had stopped days ago, as if even it had given up on moving through this dead place. Inside the cabin, the pantry shelves were bare but for a cracked jar of beans. He opened it and poured the contents into his calloused palm. 8 beans. Dull, dry, more memory than meal. He sat at the edge of the doorway, back against the frame his father had carved when the place was first built, and swallowed those beans without chewing. His jaw trembled, not from hunger, from everything else. Behind him, the empty cabin sighed with the creaks of aging wood. Dust hung still in the air like it knew better than to stir. He reached out and ran his fingers along the wall beside him, smooth from generations brushing past, stained by sweat, grit, blood, and love. There was no one left now to pass it again. Down by the corral, Dusty Jack, his gray donkey, stood motionless under the twisted mesquite. The animal's ribs pressed against his sides like warped barrel staves, but his eyes, dark, alive still, had that stubborn shine Elijah had always admired. He walked slowly to the animal, laid a hand on the donkey's warm neck, and let it stay there a moment. "You're all that's left, old friend," Elijah whispered, voice thick and cracked. From his breast pocket, he pulled out a torn scrap of paper, folded twice, and a stub of graphite whittled from a larger pencil long lost. Kneeling beside the hitch rail, he steadied his hand against the post and wrote, "If you got kindness in you, send help to Elijah Boone, Dry Willow Flats. I'll repay in labor or land. God bless you." He read it once, then twice, as if saying it louder might change something. Then, with rope stripped from his bed frame, he tied it gently to Dusty Jack's bridle, knotted tight so the wind couldn't steal it. Dusty snorted once and shook his ears, as if unimpressed. "I know," Elijah murmured, pressing his forehead briefly to the donkey's. "But you always find your way." He opened the rickety gate. Dusty Jack hesitated, looked back once, then turned and began his slow march down the trail that led east toward water, toward hope, toward the impossible. The hoofbeats faded, each step swallowed by dust and silence. And then came the other sound, hooves again, heavier, faster. From the north trail. Elijah turned sharply, squinting into the haze. 3 riders emerged, framed against the sun like bad news on horseback. The lead man wore a black duster slick with road grime and a flat-brimmed hat that shadowed his sharp face. His beard was silver at the chin, but the eyes were young cold, calculating. "Afternoon, Boone," he called, reining in hard beside the fence. The dust from his horse's hooves swept across the yard. Elijah stepped forward, instinctively glancing to where his rifle used to lean sold weeks ago for beans that were already gone. "What brings Silas Creed to my dead-end patch of dirt?" he asked dryly. Creed grinned, but there was no humor in it. "Heard you might be feeling motivated. Figured I'd make a friendly offer." One of Creed's men, a thick-armed brute with a scar down his neck, chuckled and spit in the dust. Creed dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, taking in the rotted fence, the broken shutter, the empty bucket lying near the well. $50, he said. For the whole thing. Elijah snorted. This land's been in my family 30 years. My pa saved every damn cent working other men's cattle to buy it. Creed shrugged. That was then. Now it's just sun-baked dirt and pride. When Elijah didn't answer, Creed's smile curdled. He walked over to the empty bucket, lifted it casually, and kicked it across the yard, the clatter echoing like a warning shot. Then he walked to the tool rack and picked up a splintered shovel with no blade. Hell of a symbol, he said, and with one swift move snapped it clean over his knee. Elijah flinched, but didn't move. Creed leaned in close, breath heavy with tobacco. 3 days, Boone. Then I come back. My offer drops to 20. After that, well, the vultures get what they get. Without waiting for a reply, he mounted up and tipped his hat mockingly. The 3 riders turned and trotted off, leaving Elijah in a cloud of red dust and silence. He stood there, shoulders straight, until the sound of their hooves was gone. Only then did his legs give out. He dropped to his knees in the same dirt his father had died plowing. In his hand, he held a small, worn ring of brass and leather, the bridle ring from his father's old saddle, polished smooth from years of trail. His eyes lifted east, toward the horizon. Dusty Jack was long gone. Elijah bowed his head, the ring clutched tight in his shaking fist, and somewhere, miles away, a gray donkey was walking down a dusty trail with a note tied to his bridle and all of a dying man's hope in his step. Crooked River hadn't flowed heavy in years, but it still held pockets of life if you knew where to look. On its western bend, just before it dried into a string of sun-baked puddles and scattered cattails, a low gray donkey stood belly-deep in water, lapping slow and steady. The animal's ears twitched, but didn't startle when a creaking wagon rolled into view over the rise. Ephraim Tate, merchant, widower, and 30-year rider of the back trails, reined in his team and squinted down at the donkey. He knew mules and pack animals by instinct. This one hadn't wandered far by accident. "Easy there, old fella," he murmured, stepping down and wiping his brow with a faded red kerchief. "Where'd you come from?" He noticed the scrap of paper tied to the bridle sun-worn, fluttering against the cracked leather. Ephraim crouched, one hand lightly on the donkey's neck. The knot was tight, purposeful. He untied it carefully, unfolded the message with fingers calloused from decades of saddle straps and grain sacks. His eyes scanned the shaky handwriting. "If you got kindness in you, send help to Elijah Boone, Dry Willow Flats. I'll repay in labor or land. God bless you." Ephraim didn't speak for a long moment. The wind stirred through the mesquite. His eyes drifted eastward, where he knew Dry Willow lay choked by dust, forgotten by maps. He'd passed through there years ago when Elijah's father still ran cattle on tough feed and tougher dreams. The Boones were hard people, proud and upright. And if Elijah Boone had come to this? He looked again at the donkey. Dusty Jack, he remembered now. The gray. A quiet one. Loyal. Smart, too. Ephraim exhaled slow. Then he stepped up onto the buckboard and reached beneath the seat, dragging out an old, weather-beaten leather ledger. Its spine was cracked, and the pages smelled of sweat and trail smoke. This wasn't a book of debts. This was his memory of barter, of borrowed tools, of who helped whom during floods, fires, births, and burials. He flipped to a page marked Boone. There were no numbers, just a single line in faded ink. helped dig out the Reeves place after the storm, stayed 3 days, didn't ask for pay. Ephraim snapped the book shut. "Boone's a good man," he muttered. "Our kind don't leave our own to rot." He moved fast then. From the back of his wagon he loaded a sack of flour, a bundle of jerky, a small barrel of water, 2 wool blankets, a box of cartridges he'd been saving, and a bag of salt. Not much, but it would keep a man standing a little longer. He tied the supplies to the pack frame on the donkey's back, then scratched behind its ears. "You carried his plea, Jack. Now you carry hope." But he wasn't done. He pulled a stub of charcoal pencil from his vest and a stack of blank slips from his lockbox. Then he began writing. To any rider, rancher, or neighbor, Elijah Boone of Dry Willow Flats is in need. If you've known hunger, you know his pain. If you've ever been helped, you know what to do. He copied the note over a dozen times, adjusting for names and places. With each finished message, he slipped it into a small pouch, tied it with twine, and set it aside. By the time the sun dipped behind the low ridge, Ephraim had 6 mules roped and ready each, carrying a message and a little piece of the West's soul. As twilight fell, he looked toward the distant horizon and said aloud, "Let's see if the old ways still got breath in 'em." That night, the first riders set out. A woman named Jenny McCrae took the trail south toward Red Mesa with a message tied to her saddle horn. An old couple, the Larkins, turned their wagon north toward Hollow Bluff, their son riding ahead with the letter clenched in his teeth. In Cedar Wash, a preacher read the note to his congregation by lantern light, and 5 families raised their hands to help. The network moved like blood returning to a sleeping limb, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And Creed noticed. By the morning of the second day, one of Creed's scouts brought word that people in 3 Stones were gathering beans and bullets, and a group of traders had diverted their route toward Dry Willow. Creed crushed the tin cup in his hand and snarled, "He's baited the whole damn territory with one pathetic letter." His right-hand man, Wayland, asked, "Want us to scare some of them off?" Creed didn't answer at first. Then he nodded slowly. "Burn one of the messages. Make it look like bandits hit the trail. We'll post signs. Boone's begging. Don't waste your mercy." So they did. A young rider named Eli took a shortcut through Bitter Pass and never made it out. His horse came back spooked and riderless. Later, Wayland bragged about tossing a singed letter into a saloon fireplace in Dyer's Crossing, warning the crowd, "Next one of these we catch ends up in the ground." But the fear didn't take root. In fact, it had the opposite effect. Daybreak on the 3rd day found Ephraim driving his wagon down a red dirt trail, Dusty Jack roped gently behind, now carrying fresh water skins and a strip of salt pork. They reached a bluff overlooking the basin of Dry Willow Flats. The land below looked scorched, as if God had left the stove on. But something stirred in the distance. 2 figures pacing the edges of a dry corral. One was a man barely upright. The other was a raven-colored horse with hips like coat hangers. Ephraim's heart caught when he spotted the sagging roofline of the Boone house still standing. "You held on, Elijah," he murmured. "Now let's see if the West remembers how to hold back." Behind him, a second wagon creaked into view, then a third. By the time they reached the flats, 6 wagons and 9 riders had joined the slow descent into Elijah Boone's hellscape. Each bore a letter, a load, and a story. Each had heard the whisper of a dying man tied to the bridle of a tired donkey, and each had answered. The wind had died by dawn. Not a sound stirred across Dry Willow Flats, but the brittle snap of sun-scorched grass. Elijah Boone woke on the floor of his cabin, mouth dry as cotton, breath shallow. The weak light leaking through the slats told him it was morning. The ache in his gut told him it might be his last. He pushed himself upright, ribs flaring with pain. Yesterday he'd chewed a strip of bark to fool his stomach. Today he didn't have the strength for lies. The tin pail by the door sat empty, and the skin around his eyes pulled tight with thirst. Still, habit moved his body. He stepped outside and looked toward the distant ridge. No donkey, no riders, no answer. The buzzards had returned, though, 4 of them now, circling in lazy arcs above his fields, as if they knew time was circling too. He sat on the porch, elbows on his knees, trying to will his breath steady. That's when he saw it. Smoke, curling in a soft plume from the direction of Crooked River. His heart jolted. Something primal rose in him. Fear and instinct twisted together like barbed wire. Smoke meant fire or people. Either way, it was motion, and motion out here meant change. He grabbed the pail with shaking fingers and stepped into the trail. The sun was already up, beating against his back like a hammer. The walk to Crooked River used to take him 20 minutes. This time, it took an hour and a half. He stumbled twice. Once he fell to his knees so hard his chin hit the ground. The second time, he didn't get up right away. His hands trembled against the dirt. The world swam sideways. "Please," he whispered hoarsely, "don't let it be a mirage." When he finally crested the last ridge above the river, what he saw made him stop cold. A camp, real and breathing. 3 wagons, a canvas lean-to, and a campfire crackling low. Horses tethered in a rough line, and people, real people, moving about like this was just another day on the trail. Elijah's knees buckled again, but this time arms caught him before the ground did. "You're Elijah Boone," came a woman's voice, low, sharp, and laced with kindness that had known sorrow. He blinked up at her. A woman in her 40s, lean as a rail, wearing a trail hat and a Winchester across her back. "Nora Hensley," she said. "You're safe. Sit down." He tried to speak, but only croaked. "Here." She handed him a tin cup. It was full of water. He drank like a dying man. The water spilled down his chin, soaking into the collar of his shirt. By the time he finished, he was shaking not from weakness, but from the way relief hit him like a flood. Another figure approached. An older man with a snow-white beard and a jerky pouch slung over his shoulder. "Pete Garrison," he said. "Trapper. Heard your letter made the rounds. I figured if a man's got guts enough to tie hope to a donkey, he's worth showing up for." Elijah stared, lips cracked open. "You read the note?" Pete nodded and pulled a folded copy from his vest pocket. "Not just me. More coming. Whole damn frontier's stirred up like ants in a kicked nest." Elijah sat by the fire, Nora passing him a strip of salt pork and a heel of bread. He chewed like a man relearning the act. Nobody spoke for a while. Then he noticed a familiar sound, a low, rhythmic clop-clop echoing down the riverbank. He turned his head and saw Dusty Jack. The old gray donkey stood there, ears forward, loaded down with 2 bulging water skins and a saddle blanket tied with bundles of flour and beans. Ephraim Tate followed behind, grinning through the dust. "Elijah," he called. "Looks like you started something bigger than just staying alive." Elijah didn't answer. Couldn't. He looked at the donkey, at the water, at the wagons and supplies, at the people. Then, for the first time in weeks, he cried. Not out of shame, not weakness. But because he realized something he hadn't dared hope for, he wasn't alone anymore. By midday, the camp had doubled. Riders from Cedar Ridge arrived first, 3 families in 2 wagons, loaded with preserved peaches, sacks of grain, and fresh-caught rabbits. Then came 2 young cowhands from Whiskey Hollow, trailing a pack mule with tools and tobacco. One by one, they came. Every rider carried a message. Some literal, others carried in stories and actions. They'd heard about the man in Dry Willow who sent a note on a donkey and asked for nothing but mercy. Most of them had lived that story themselves at some point, lost a crop, buried a child, got snowed in and thought the world had forgot them. Boone's message didn't beg. It reminded. It reminded them who they used to be before barbed wire and busted treaties and land barons made them hard. That night, as the fire flickered low and the stars came out, Elijah sat beside Dusty Jack, scratching the donkey's ears. "Didn't figure you'd make it back," he murmured. "Didn't figure anybody would listen." Dusty brayed softly, then plopped down beside him with a grunt. Nora brought over a blanket and draped it around Elijah's shoulders. "You asked for help," she said. "That ain't weakness. That's strength most men forgot existed." Pete Garrison passed around a jug of firewater, and laughter began to bubble among the circle. Talk turned to tomorrow repairing the roof, digging a new well, fencing off the northern slope. Then someone pointed toward the trailhead. "Riders," they said. At first, just 2 shadows, then 6, then a dozen. Donkeys, mules, riders, wagons. They came from every direction, forming a slow parade across the moonlit flats. They came with food, seed, tools, lumber. Some came with nothing but their hands, and that was enough. Elijah stood, blinking at the line of lights winding toward his ranch. Torches flickered, lanterns swayed. The hoofbeats became a steady hymn, echoing across the basin. His legs trembled, but this time it wasn't hunger. It was the sight of dozens, then scores of neighbors, strangers, and kin by action crossing the desert to lift him back up. Behind him, Ephraim whispered, "You built a church without walls, Boone. All you did was ring the bell." By sunrise on the 4th day, Dry Willow Flats had become unrecognizable. Where once there was only dust and despair, now stood a makeshift settlement brimming with motion and murmurs. Tents were staked in neat lines, wagons circled like a defensive ring, and hammers thudded against new fence posts. From Elijah's porch, the land no longer looked hollow. It looked like hope was rebuilding itself. The smell of bacon drifted on the morning air. Somewhere, someone was singing a hymn out of tune. Children chased each other around a water trough that hadn't existed 48 hours ago. But even amid the gentle bustle, tension coiled like a snake in the grass. Elijah knew it was only a matter of time. He stood with Ephraim Tate and Nora Hensley near the edge of the field, where a garden plot was being measured out. Dusty Jack stood beside him, braying softly as if sensing the shift in the air. Pete Garrison approached, his boots stirring up red dirt, his voice low. "Creed's comin'. Saw a dust trail an hour out. 6 riders, maybe more. They're moving like they mean trouble." Ephraim spat into the soil and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Let him come. Man's about to learn what a united frontier looks like." Elijah didn't answer. He just stared down the trail, jaw set. His shoulders had filled back out some since the camp formed, but the scars of hunger and fear still sat in the corners of his eyes. By noon, they heard the hoofbeats. The crowd grew quiet as Silas Creed and his men crested the ridge. The sun sat behind them, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl ahead of their horses like threats made flesh. Creed wore a fresh black duster, the silver trim on his boots catching the light. His eyes scanned the crowd like a man inspecting livestock. They rode in slowly, like they owned the place. Creed dismounted first. His men fanned out behind him, rifles slung but hands twitching near the stocks. He walked toward the heart of the camp, where Elijah stood by the well, a dozen folks behind him. "This ends now," Creed called, voice calm but cutting. "Whatever. Charity circus you folks are running. It's done. Boone's land is still forfeit, and I've got paperwork says as much." Nobody moved. The silence was a living thing. Ephraim stepped forward. "There's no law out here but decency, Creed. You lost that claim when you tried to buy a man's grave for $50 and spit on his last shovel." Creed smiled. "You think a few bags of beans and a chorus of sob stories changes anything? This land's dust. You're just delaying the inevitable." Then, like thunder rolling in from nowhere, came the sound. 100 hoofbeats. The rhythmic clatter of iron shoes and wooden panniers. From the east and south, across 2 dusty ridgelines came donkeys, dozens of them. Pack animals of every shade and size, flanked by riders and wagons, emerging one after another in a procession that looked biblical in scope. They carried seed, lumber, fabric, ropes, medicine, nails, soap, wire, lanterns, and eyes filled with purpose. At the front rode Clayton Reeves, a thick-chested trader with the voice of a preacher and the authority of a general. His coat was faded buckskin, and his hat bore the scars of a dozen trails. He halted his mount beside Elijah and nodded. "Heard one man asked for help," he said, voice like gravel soaked in honey. "We're here to make sure nobody forgets how to answer." Creed's face froze. Behind Clayton, another wave crested the southern hill. More riders, more donkeys, children waving, flags fluttering from wagon poles. It was no longer a gathering. It was a movement. Creed reached for his gun belt, not to draw, but to rest his hand there, a warning. His men stiffened, and the crowd noticed. Fingers twitched. Nora Hensley moved half a step closer to Elijah, her Winchester cradled in her arms like a sleeping baby. Pete Garrison shifted his coat just enough to show the long knife at his hip. The air went still. 1 heartbeat. 2. Creed's lip curled. "You're playing a dangerous game, Boone. Think all this makes you bulletproof?" Elijah stepped forward. His voice was hoarse, but it carried. "I ain't bulletproof, Creed. Just tired of kneeling." There was a pause. Then he raised his chin. "I ain't selling. I ain't running. I'm building. And these folks, they ain't just here for me. They're here because they're done watching men like you strip this land bare and call it progress." Creed's face twitched, a crack in his practiced sneer. He glanced at the donkeys, at the wagons, at the 200 people standing behind Boone now. Then came a voice from the crowd. "We'll build it together!" Another shouted. "This land's got roots again!" And then the sound, like church bells on the plains, 1,000 tin cups clanking against canteens and wagon rails. A rough, rising cheer that grew into a roar. Creed stood frozen. His men looked uncertain now, glancing sideways. Clayton Reeves stepped forward. "You brought a deed and a threat," he said. "We brought a town." Creed narrowed his eyes. "This ain't over." "No," Clayton agreed. "It's just beginning." Without another word, Creed turned back toward his horse. He mounted up, stiff-spined, and rode off in silence. His men followed, slower this time, unsure of what they were leaving behind. Dusty Jack brayed once. Loud, triumphant. As the sun dipped behind the western cliffs, Elijah stood amid the growing camp, surrounded by voices and hammering and the scent of stew cooking on open fires. A baby cried somewhere. A dog barked. Two boys argued over whose donkey was stronger. Elijah looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, still shaking, but no longer with fear. Beside him, Nora handed him a folded scrap of paper, his original message, now worn and creased. "Clayton wants to frame it," she said. "Says it'll go up in the trading post when it's built." Elijah looked out across the flats. "No," he said. "We ain't done yet." She smiled. "Then let's get to work." 3 months later, Dry Willow Flats was no longer a dying patch of dirt. It was a heartbeat in the desert. The wind still kicked up dust now and then, but it no longer felt like ruin. It felt like work in progress. Between the ridgelines and the cracked arroyos, a settlement had risen, not hurried, not perfect, but alive. The new Miller's Creek trading post sat at the heart of it all. What used to be a dry ditch and a broken trail now housed a canvas-roofed depot, a 2-pen livestock enclosure, and a growing garden flanked by whitewashed fences. Kids ran barefoot past its walls, laughter ringing between the clapboards, while hammer strikes from a nearby forge marked the hours louder than any church bell ever could. Elijah Boone stood on the porch of his newly rebuilt cabin. His boots were dusted, his shirt tucked, his spine straight. He still carried the lean shadow of hunger in his face, but his eyes had changed. They no longer scanned the horizon for salvation. They watched people build. A group of boys dashed past, waving sticks like cavalry swords. One of them paused at the foot of the porch and tiptoed toward Dusty Jack, who was dozing under a cottonwood tree nearby. The boy whispered something into the donkey's ear, then grinned and ran off again. Dusty didn't flinch. He just opened one eye and huffed, as if legends didn't need to chase rumors. They just were. Dusty Jack had become something of a myth around these parts. Folks said he could smell a lie, that he'd once carried 3 riders out of a canyon fire, that he only brayed when someone was about to make a bad decision. Most of it was tall talk. Elijah never corrected it. He just kept a bucket of oats by the porch and let folks pat the old gray's neck for luck. Clayton Reeves arrived just before noon, his leather satchel slung across his shoulder and dust trailing from his coat. He looked tired, but satisfied, the kind of man who had been riding for days with purpose and a clean conscience. "Got 15 more," he said, dropping the satchel beside Elijah's boots. Elijah bent down, pulled out a bundle of envelopes, and started thumbing through the requests. Copper Ridge family lost their barn in a lightning strike. 2 widows in Whistle Hollow need seed for spring planting. There's a wagon team stuck up in Silver Pass. They need rope, blankets, and a mule team to pull them out. He read each one aloud, his voice steady, his brow creased not with worry but focus. These weren't stories anymore. They were assignments. A system had been born, and he was helping run it. Clayton leaned against the porch rail and sipped from his canteen. "Fletcher's still spreading dirt in the east. Tells folks we're overreaching, gonna collapse under our own good intentions." Elijah chuckled. "Well, he's not wrong. We are overreaching, but that's the only way to reach folks who got no one left." Clayton nodded, then turned serious. "That's why I'm here. We want you to head it up." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Head what up?" "The whole damn network," Clayton said. "You'd oversee relay stations, train folks in the outer territories, coordinate supply chains, make sure the message system runs clean." Elijah stared out at the dusty road. 2 new wagons were arriving from the North Trail, their flags bearing the now familiar red mule insignia of the cooperative. Folks had started calling it the Long Bridle, a name born from the image of a message tied to one old donkey's worn leather strap. "Seems like a lot," Elijah said quietly. "It is," Clayton replied. "But you started it. And more than that, you understand it. This ain't about charity. It's about survival with dignity. Frontier's changin'. If we don't change with it, we'll rot like the rest." Elijah didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked out over the settlement. The forge hammer rang again. Chickens clucked near the coop. A girl ran past carrying a jar of honey, shouting something about bees escaping. "All right," he said. "I'll do it. But I don't want it centralized. Every settlement keeps its autonomy. No one answers to Dry Willow, they answer to each other." Clayton smiled. "That's the boon I was hoping for." In the weeks that followed, Elijah threw himself into the work. He traveled from outpost to outpost, teaching ranch hands and former drifters how to coordinate requests, manage caches, and run message routes using donkey relays. The dusty trails, once ruled by silence, were now filled with hoofbeats, handshakes, and folded notes passed from one settlement to the next. They mapped out new, safe trails, built way stations with shade and fresh water, created rotating supply loops that kept distant communities from falling through the cracks. And Dusty Jack? He went with him, of course, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always watching. People swore the donkey could sniff out a man's character before he opened his mouth. More than once, Elijah had caught Dusty refusing to cross someone's threshold only, to learn later that the man inside had double-dealt the co-op. One evening, as the hills burned gold with autumn and the skies turned lavender behind them, Elijah returned home to a letter waiting on his porch. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting inside was clean, careful. "Dear Mr. Boone, I wanted you to know your message gave my mama the strength to ask for help when my little sister got the fever. She wouldn't have made it without what y'all sent. Thank you. Sometimes I think the bravest thing is saying you can't do it alone. Sarah Beth McAllister, age 10, Lost Canyon." Elijah sat down on the porch steps, letter in hand, and read it again. And again. Then he walked inside, reached up to the wall, and carefully unhooked the small wooden frame that held the original message, the note he'd tied to Dusty Jack's bridle on the worst day of his life. He slipped Sarah Beth's letter behind it, smoothing it flat with a calloused palm. Then, with a trembling pencil, he added a line beneath the old message. Just 6 words. Sometimes the quietest messages echo loudest. He hung it back on the wall. Dusty Jack wandered up behind him and rested his heavy head on Elijah's shoulder. And together, in the fading light, man and donkey sat in the home they'd saved, not just for themselves, but for every forgotten voice that needed a trail, a friend, or a way forward through the dust. If Elijah's story of resilience and community spoke to you, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Every story we tell honors the history and spirit of the American West. And if you want to see more incredible tales from the frontier, check out these videos on your screen right now. They're filled with the same kind of forgotten heroes and quiet triumphs. Hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone you think needs a reminder that hope always finds a way. Thanks for watching.